Good afternoon, Leo.
Good afternoon.
It's been a long time coming. I've had you, when I started doing this project, I'd compiled this list of people. And you were not on the top 5, but you were not far below that. And, I've been looking for a time that we could get together and talk, and I'm glad that we have been able to do that in spite of, all of the drama that's been going on in your life today, right?
Yes, yeah. Just a little bit, yes.
So I understand you had a little bit of trouble with your tires today?
So it was actually yesterday. I bought 4 new tires a week ago on my wife's car. It's a 2015 Toyota 4Runner. Got it, and I love a new set of tires on a car.
Yes.
So I'm excited. It snowed, a week later. I got 4 new tires on a 4-wheel
pat
drive.
On the back,
yes. 4Runner, 4-wheel drive. I go out to the Harris house to do a speaking engagement yesterday morning at 10:30 a.m. Meeting that I was speaking at. And I do my thing, and I'm leaving. It's 11:30 at Harris house in St. Charles. I'm coming down 364, the new part of the page extension, coming back, and all of a sudden my tire light comes on. Now, we've driven for a week on these, so, it wasn't something that immediately, happened driving off the lot. But the tire light comes on, so I thought, well, maybe it's just low because it's cold out.
Right.
You get the low,
Yeah.
And
and it's been cold.
And it's been cold
this past week.
So it feels fine. So I keep driving. Then I start to feel that it's not fine. So I go, well, where am I? I start looking. Where's the exit? And it was like 2 miles to the next exit. So unfortunately, by the time I got to Bennington, I was pretty flat.
Oh, were you?
Get off on Bennington, pull on a little side street just to get out of the way, and then now the tire's really flat. Well, I couldn't. Those 4Runners have a tire underneath the car that lowers down. You got to crank it down, and it's they're a little tricky.
Yeah.
I knew exactly where the tire was and what I would need to do, but I hadn't done it before on this car. This is my second new set of tires. I've had the car for 7 years. My second new set of tires on it. Never had a flat. So
you must not drive a whole lot as compared to me.
It's got about 80,000 miles. So,
okay.
So I tried to lower it and I couldn't. So I call I've got I spent a little while and I just couldn't figure out how to get the tire down so that I could then, take off the old one and put on the spare. So I called my insurance that I've got emergency service with.
Right.
And, because of the snow the days earlier, all these emergency road crews are tied up, I guess, still pulling cars out of ditches from 2 days ago.
Why don't you stay there, sir, and somebody will be with you in the next 48 hours.
Exactly. That's exactly how that went. So, long story short, it took about an hour to get scheduled. They were trying to find somebody to schedule me with. Everybody said, can't do it today. And I'm on a residential street, but I'm really kind of blocking a side of the road. So finally they go, okay, there's going to be somebody there in an hour and a half to 2 hours. But I'll go, okay, I'm okay. Yeah, I can deal with that. Managing to keep my cool through all of this. Here, it's a brand new set of tires. I've got things to do. But I'm like, okay, I know everybody's busy. So I knew the moment I called them, it was going to be a wait. Yeah. So I wait 2 hours, and then they text me and said, has the provider arrived yet to switch your tire? And I text back, no. And a couple minutes later, they text back and go, oh, they're not going to be able to come. We're going to start over to find you a new provider, so then I called a couple myself, and they all said 2 hours. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to wait another 2 hours. So I started to try to again, I took the tools out and said, I've got to figure out how to crank down this wheel. And a man came by who lived on this street that I was on, and he said, I saw you 3 hours ago out here doing this, and you don't seem like you've made much progress. And I said, no, I have not. He said, I live down at the very end of the block here. I've got a garage full of tools. I've got a hydraulic lift,
right,
and air gun, everything that we would need. He said, I'm good at this. I used to work for, I can't remember, Sears Tire. He worked for somebody, like the Sears Automotive. He said, you come down to my house, I'll get this. So I drove down on the flat to his house, backed in, 15 minutes later, my spare is on, and I'm good to go. Now I wake up this morning and my spare is flat.
What is going on?
So the problem is that thing has sat underneath that car for 7 years, unused.
Oh, right.
And he pumped it up. When he put it on, he did fill it up.
Right.
But I guess a seal it wasn't completely sealed.
Yeah.
Because it has been
or a valve
exposed.
stem.
Or a valve stem. I mean, it's been sitting down there exposed.
Yeah.
So I actually ran over to Home Depot. I had a hand pump, but it wouldn't pump the tire. I ran over to Home Depot and got a small electric pump. It was $25, really cheap.
Yeah.
A small
I
electric
have one
pump.
of those for my dirt bikes. Yeah.
Plug it in,
And set the pressure
it
up.
took a couple minutes.
Yeah. it's like an old man
It's a little slow, right? A little slow. But got the tire filled up and drove it and dropped it off at Firestone. They've already said they're going to replace the tire.
Okay.
There was damage to it, so apparently I ran over something.
Ah.
But they said I actually didn't buy they've got a warranty that is for damage, a tire damage warranty.
Right.
I didn't buy that because in the past I bought it and didn't use it. And he said, it will be cheaper for you to now buy it on all the tires and I'll retroactively apply it than to buy a tire.
Yeah,
so
and
it's about half the price of a tire. I go, okay, I'll do it.
Was it?
Yeah.
Half the price of the tire?
For all four of them to add the warranty.
Okay.
The road hazard warranty.
Yeah, I had my tires replaced. I don't know. I think it was like $15 a tire, but maybe it's different for tire trucks. Who knows?
Yeah. So anyway,
So that was number one, and then just before we were getting ready to drive down here, you thought you had a medical emergency. Something with your eye.
Yes.
Which fortunately. Apparently, was not a true emergency, but still is something that needs to be looked at.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So now about 6 months ago, I had laser surgery in my right. I had to repair my retina.
Okay.
And the sign that I had a problem was that I started to see floaters in my eye, looks like, first I thought it was like a gnat flying around. But then it looked like a Rorschach chart in my eye.
Wow.
And I went and they said, come immediately. When that happened, they had me come immediately, and they did find a tear in the retina. And they repaired it, on the spot. They do it the same day.
Well, I'm glad they were able to do that.
Yeah.
Your training is in psychology, isn't it?
My training from a very long time ago was in psychology.
So I was wondering what that Rorschach pattern was throwing out in your head.
I tried to figure it out. Exactly.
Yeah.
But you were right. You remember. My degree is in psychology, yes.
So, but anyways, it was meant to be, right?
It was meant to be. So my left eye started to do the same thing. I did call the retina specialist, and they just said, we'll see you in the morning. We'll see you tomorrow morning. You're fine.
Yeah. So your eyes and mine are sort of shaped the same way. So do you have high intraocular pressure too, or not?
I don't know if I have that. It was interesting when they did the first retina. He said you have an identical weakness in the other side.
There you go.
They're mirrored.
Yeah. I have been told the same thing,
Yes.
and there's retinal detachments that run in my family.
Right.
One of my mom's brothers is an ophthalmologist in England, and he was in France and started noticing the floaters and the shining lights, which they call scintillating scotomas, and he was like, oh, I'm getting a retinal detachment. So he drove himself back to England through the tunnel and got it repaired in England. So, yeah. And I've been told, hey, you're at high risk for that too. So I get yearly eye exams.
Yeah, right.
So to backtrack a little bit and, establish who you are for our listeners, you're a St. Louis boy.
I am. I'm born and raised in St. Louis.
Yeah. And as such, I think it behooves us to ask where you went to school.
Sure. So do you want to know where I grew up or where I went to school? Or
tell me as much as you like. I am, I actually wanted to ask you this opinion I have, and maybe you can elaborate on it, which is that, for those of us who come from, I don't really want to say feudal, but, established class societies to America, the dream is always, hey, we are finally stepping into an egalitarian society, which is essentially classless, because the middle class is so big that almost everybody that you come in contact with is in the middle class. Right. But we know that is not really true.
Not really true.
There are little hints and messages about classes, which hint at elitism. Did you go to private school? Did you go to public school?
Right.
Did you go to private Catholic school? Whatever it is. Right. And I think in St. Louis, asking another person, hey, where'd you go to school, is sort of, feeling the other person out for, okay, what kind of socioeconomic background they come from, what kind of, neighborhood they grew up in, etc. So assume that all those questions are implicitly asked in my question.
Yeah, very good. And it's true. And I'd say, I'm sure that there are other cities that are like this. I'm sure that America reflects this very much so, but maybe less in rural areas. But I'm sure there are other cities that it's exactly the same. That there's 10 layers or 20 layers inside of the middle class. And another 10 or 20 even inside the upper class. I mean, when somebody who I might think of as wealthy, they see themselves at the low end of what's wealthy. Maybe they've got $5 million, but they are looking at someone with $100 million or a billionaire, and the types of toys that they have, and the type of house that they live in, and the neighborhood that they live in, and so it's interesting. Even I think among the elite, there's 10 layers of elite,
yeah,
elitism.
Yeah.
But I went to Metro Classical Academy in the city. It was called Metro High School at the time. It's a public high school in the city of St. Louis. Now, the elitism associated with that particular school is intellectual elitism. Exactly. It is a competitive. It's competitive like college or like a private school to get in. Mm-hmm. So it's a magnet school. They are. It is not associated with a neighborhood or with a district. It's part of the St. Louis Public School District, but it's not a neighborhood school that if you live within such boundaries, you automatically get to go.
Right.
So it's drawn.
So did you have to take tests or?
Yeah. So it was the Missouri Basic Skills Test, which everybody takes, but it was a certain score, a certain level on that test, and then it was an essay, and then it was an interview.
So you were taking these tests to get into the school?
No, you take them anyway. So
okay.
You take them in grade school anyway. And I did have to go to Crossroads for junior high school, which was a private junior high school.
Okay.
I went to city public schools for most of my grade school years. Mm-hmm. There's a whole long story behind all of those and how I ended up at Metro. But I was on my second stepfather, my mother's third marriage, by the time I was 8.
Wow.
And
that's a lot of change.
There was a lot of change.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of moves.
Uh-huh.
So I went to a couple of different grade schools, but when I was in maybe second grade, my mother and stepfather that I have today, they've been married for 50 plus years, got married and moved to the Central West End when it was kind of cool, but houses were $17,000. It was not like anything like it is today. Right. And so it was a big house. She had kids, he had kids, and they were having kids together.
Wow!
So they said,
"So you
could get a big house for $17,000." With window air conditioners. There was lead paint everywhere. I mean, it wasn't quite as nice as it sounds.
Right.
But I continued to go to. So I continued to go to grade school in the city of St. Louis, and then actually down. I had spent 2 years living in the projects down. Laclede Town. I don't know if you're familiar with Laclede Town. That name.
Where is Laclede Town? I'm familiar with Laclede.
Yeah, it's gone now. So it's, it was basically at Compton. Compton down near Harristow.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, some of what's now Harristow was where Laclede Town was.
I see.
Some of the property went to SLU, some went to Harristow, but basically right in that area.
Okay. All right.
And it was it was a mixed income housing project of low rises. There had been some high rise housing projects in St. Louis that failed. Pruitt-Igoe is one of them. And this was a low rise, so there were small townhouses, and therefore called Laclede Town.
Right.
But when my mother got divorced from my first stepfather, she was a preschool teacher in supporting us.
Wow.
And so we were eligible to live in subsidized housing, and we did. So I went to that grade school that was there next to this housing project, and I liked it.
Yeah.
So when we moved to the West End, I kept going to that grade school. I took a public bus.
Oh, is that right?
Down to that grade school, and went to school through 5th grade at Waring School. I think the building is still there. It's called Waring School. It was at basically at Compton and Laclede.
Yeah.
So then we were in the West End. I went to Crossroads, which is next door to where the Lindell Club is now.
Oh, okay.
That was then Crossroads.
I see.
The Catholic Church.
The Rosati Kane school now?
No, right next door to the Lindell Club, there's a building now that's Ledoux Nails.
Oh yeah, the
white
spa
building,
and
the white stone building.
Right.
That has belonged until now, and it may still belong to the Catholic Church. It belonged then, and they rented it to my junior high school. It was a junior high school in that building, and eventually it was Catholic Family Services after that.
Okay.
Building. And then now Ledoux Nails.
So you basically,
right at home.
visit your grade school.
So that was where I went to middle school, basically.
Yeah.
And then I went to high
So
school.
it must have been a
Metro.
small school.
It was very small.
Yeah.
There might have been 100 kids.
Okay.
And then it was private and a great little school.
Yeah.
And then I went from there to Metro.
So this pursuit of what seems to be academic excellence, was this externally imposed on you, or was this something you were naturally good at subjects and studies, etc.?
So a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I think I was relatively bright. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not a genius, but I was
Right.
I was relatively bright. I learned quickly.
Paid attention. You were a good
Didn't
kid.
pay attention, so that was a challenge. I have ADHD, and I was
Okay.
not aware of it until I was an adult.
Really?
Yes. I
So
was
were you
diagnosed as an
disruptive in
adult.
class? I know I was, and
I wasn't a class clown, but what happened was my grades would always be like A in achievement, B in effort.
Yeah.
Right, so there'd always be notes. So if he tried harder, if he paid more attention in class,
He'd get what, 2 A's?
I guess.
Yeah.
So. I don't know. Right, exactly. So an A plus, I guess.
Yeah, I guess.
But
Yeah.
there was always a little comment about my behavior
Yeah.
or my lack of paying attention. But
Mine was about talking.
okay.
Yeah, more than anything else. And if there were like kids who needed to be brought out of their shell, they were usually assigned a desk next to me because I would bring them out of their shell. And none of my friends was ever allowed to sit next to me because that was a total disaster.
Right.
Yeah, so it's so interesting. It's what was the ADHD part of it challenging for you? Did you ever think, why am I like this?
Yes.
Or were you just
No, I
in
didn't.
so many places in your head that...
No, I thought there was something wrong with me. I just didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
I did. I thought there was something. When I ended up at Washington University after I went to Metro.
Right.
So my bachelor's is from Washington U, and I remember, because I didn't get diagnosed until I was in my early 30s. I remember trying to figure out how do these kids sit and study. I would go to the library and I could not sit still at the library the way the other kids did. I mean, they would sit there and just not move,
Right.
And I lasted about 20 minutes. I'd get up, go get a drink of water, walk around a little bit, you know. I just couldn't sit there and do the work. And I just I didn't understand why everybody else could.
Yeah.
It just appeared that they could. And this was, I went to high school in the late 70s. It was really before they began to diagnose kids with ADHD, at least with any regularity.
Right.
I mean, I think if you had real behavioral issues, you might get in front of a psychiatrist who might catch it.
Yeah.
But I was kind of a people pleaser, so while I was inattentive at times, I was not a troublemaker.
Okay. So before we accompany you further on your narrative, there's a couple of things that I want to go back to. One is, a picture of your dad that I've always remarked on, which I find for some reason it just always grabs my attention whenever you post it. And you've done it on a couple of Father's Days, on Facebook and stuff, which is that of your dad. And I assume that was your biological father?
That's my biological father,
yeah. And he's speaking at a political rally or a gathering of people, and I understand that he was a political activist and an activist for diversity and equal rights, etc., etc. Yeah. Would you tell us a little bit about your dad and his work?
So my father spent most of his career working for Human Development Corporation, HDC. I believe that it's now been dismantled.
Yeah.
It was when he started to work there. It was
and what was that, a state organization? Department?
It was originally a federally funded organization, and then eventually did during the Reagan era with the block grants. They dismantled a lot of federal funded organizations and sent the funding to the states.
Okay.
So it did eventually become a state funded.
I see.
Through a pretty big change that the Reagan administration.
Was the Reagan administration trying to get more accountability, or
I think they were trying to get the federal government out of a lot of.
I see.
I think they were really just
okay. So the agenda limiting federal outreach and basically letting the states
have a do or don't do, right?
Yeah,
right. Sort of you you do or you don't do, but we're going to get out of the business.
All right, please continue.
So I think during the 60s and certainly at the height of the civil rights era, I guess through the Nixon era, and then I guess around the time of maybe even Carter, but maybe who was right before Carter? Was it was Nixon and then Ford, and then I guess Carter.
Yeah.
There was a pretty big movement to try to. There were a lot of federal programs to eliminate poverty or to try to reduce poverty in the cities, and it was, I think, connected to the civil rights movement of the mid and late '60s. I think that the push to get the federal government involved in economic economy, maybe not equality, but certainly to try to let's keep
some
up a little
parity,
bit. Some attempt to for some economic equality, and so there began to be federal programs to pay for things like air conditioners for poor people's homes. Right. There were federal food surplus giveaways the federal government used to stockpile. Sort of, I guess, again, as part of the Cold War, used to stockpile food supplies, and eventually they would get near their
expiration,
their shelf life,
and
they would literally go into the city and use organizations like the one that my dad worked for to distribute those food supplies, cheese and butter, that kind of stuff, to people who were. This is before there was a lot of food pantries and stuff.
Was your dad a college educated man?
He was.
And what was his degree or area of study?
I think his bachelor's degree was in sociology. His master's degree was in social work from Washington U. He went to Mizzou for his bachelor's degree as part of the what's the Army program called?
GI Bill.
The GI Bill, exactly. So he went to. He was the only one in his entire family. He was the youngest and the only one to go to college.
Okay, gotcha.
Out of his siblings.
All right.
And went on the GI Bill. I think his bachelor's was in sociology, but his master's was in social work. And so he eventually became. He was in charge of all the what was called the neighborhood programs at Human Development Corporation. So all of their pretty much everything that wasn't administration, pretty much everything that wasn't finance, HR, that sort of thing. He ran the program itself. So they had Head Start. They had the Head Start contract for the city and county. They had about a dozen community centers that ran after-school programs for kids whose parents, worked and didn't have anywhere to go after school. They ran the federal food giveaway programs. They ran all of the Heat Up St. Louis, all the programs to identify and fund
areas
of need for basically economic areas of need. The population that he served was about 98% African American.
Is that right?
So it was mostly all the community centers were in the city.
So let me ask you this: you were pretty young when your mom and your dad got divorced.
I was 3.
So did you have contact with him later on as you grew up? Did you see him do this kind of work and adopted him as a role model, so to speak, or got some kind of this is what a man does in his life kind of lesson?
So I think I drew a lot from him and from my current stepfather. My first stepfather was brief. It was maybe 2 or 3 years when I was a child. But the stepfather that my mother is married to now and has been for 50 years, I also certainly adopted a lot of, and he similar, but they met. My mother and my stepfather met at a Socialist Workers' Party gathering in the 60s and the late 60s, or maybe 1970. Yeah. So he had a similar take. He happened to be a physician. He was a general and vascular surgeon at Jewish.
Oh, okay.
But had a similar political view that my father had and that my mother had.
Okay.
So I think I took a lot from both of them. But I was around my father. He stayed in St. Louis. He actually had an opportunity for a big job in Dallas and didn't move because his kids were here.
He was investing.
Yeah, he was not going to. And so we saw him. It wasn't like it is today. We didn't live with him half of the time the way that they do it now. We saw him on weekends.
Yeah.
But I saw him. I mean, I was exposed to him my whole life. I was, on a certainly a weekly basis.
So the other question about your childhood that I had, and I don't know that we've ever talked about it, is was it, a lot of us grow up in essentially secular childhoods. Even me coming from a country which is essentially known as a Muslim country. I was born and raised in Pakistan. But when I think about it, my childhood and my education and my training was essentially secular. I mean, there were hints of religion there, but we were by no means, okay, you got to go to the mosque or what have you. Right. Did you grow up in a household of faith, or
No, it was very secular. Very secular. So I was not bar mitzvahed. I began the process, but not living with my dad. My stepfather's not Jewish. So my mother and father are both Jewish. My stepfather was Marxist when it comes to religion. So he was anti-religion. He had been born Episcopalian and raised Episcopalian, but as we've heard before, didn't darken the doors of the church after he was once he got confirmed or whatever. He didn't darken the doors of the church other than when it was unwise to miss wedding and funeral. And so we were very secular. Once my mother married him, which was when I was 8 years old. When she was married to my mother, we they did send us to Sunday school. So when I was very young, I went to Sunday school. It wasn't a religious home. But we did we had a little bit of training, which was just, a couple hours on the weekend. I never went to a faith-based, school, grade school, high school, anything like that. And we really didn't go to services, to religious services. I mean, my dad always went to the high holidays, which is Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, the two sort of most holy holidays. And so I got used to doing that. I went with him. He would take the three of us, his three kids. He'd ask us to go, and we would go usually every year to those to religious services for those two holidays. And then after, when we got old enough that it was really, our own decision, I continued to do that, sort of that minimum amount. And to this day, that's kind of what we do with our kids. So we do, we go to a couple times. I belong to a synagogue, Central Reform. It's the only one in the city.
So is that the one on
Waterman there and Kings Highway?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's the only synagogue in the city.
I was researching a gangster who was part of gangster wars in the Marion area, where I live and work during my work week, and the gangster was originally a Russian Jew who'd come here, and I forget the name off the cuff right now, but he's buried in that cemetery on Page. There's a couple of Jewish cemeteries at sort of the U City area. The U City area as you head out towards 170.
So maybe Olive. He's probably at Olive and Hanley.
Yeah. And, to one of my friends who actually was going to help me with this, he dug up where he was buried, and he actually went and took pictures of his grave, and he was like, well, if you want to do the background research, I know where the guy's buried. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. But remind me so somebody had given me, it was called the Heron Massacre, and, he was part of the whole thing, and, it had roots in, the conflict between Catholicism, Italian Catholics, and the Klan, and the Masons, and it gets complicated there, and it's interesting history there. So, anyways, you grow up and you decide. Did you know what you were going to do when you were in high school?
No, I had no idea.
Yeah,
I had absolutely no idea. Yeah.
How was school for you? Was that a pleasant experience? I mean, usually kids who are bright, they tend to have better experiences in school. How was it for you?
Middle school, junior high school was miserable. I had friends, but I also, they were mean kids. And so they picked on, if you weren't
bullying,
popular or whatever, there was a lot of bullying. So although it was a small private school where you got a lot of attention, from academically, from teachers, and I absolutely loved the structure of the school. I mean, it was really, they wanted you to try to find things that you liked to learn about, and it wasn't sort of your standardized public education, and nor was Metro high school either. And so I certainly liked the structure of the school, but in terms of I think that was probably, middle school was probably where I felt the most sort of separated from the world. While I had friends, I didn't feel great. In high school, and I guess I can't talk a ton about myself without talking about being sober.
Right.
So I've been sober for 25 and a half years.
Yeah.
And,
well,
but in high school, I became very, very popular, but I got in with a crowd that smoked a lot of marijuana, that smoked pot, and that was sort of the niche that I fell into, and it was a group of smart kids. It was a high school that you could very easily be, you flunk out very easily.
Yeah.
So you had to keep your grades up. They had a pretty high standard to remain at Metro, and so it was it was late '70s. So by the '80s, if you were a pot smoker, you were a burnout. But in the '70s, it was like cool.
Yeah.
Like a cool thing. So I kind of found myself in that group. We were partiers, and again very strong academically, the whole group of us. But we were really partiers, and that's kind of where I found my niche in high school. And so I did feel good about, I was comfortable in high school. When I got to Wash U, I started again to feel sort of that less than thing that a lot of alcoholics and addicts have.
So, one of the things that I was thinking about, I do a little bit of mental preparation for when I invite somebody to come and talk to me, and I was thinking about growing up and rites of passage, and bar mitzvahs,
right.
which is the Jewish
ritual
or rite of passage, where a boy goes through the passage, through the ritual, and then is pronounced a man, right?
Yeah.
And the female version of it is called the bat mitzvah, or bat mitzvah, right? And if we look at human society and put it in perspective, what we mistakenly or misguidedly sometimes label as primitive societies, that, or let's say, non-industrialized societies, which have, the emphasis is more on the tribe and the family, etc.
Right.
They tend to have very well pronounced rituals whereby a kid lives with the female part of the family until a certain age, and then a rite of passage happens, and then you turn into a man, and then your life is essentially with men, etc. Right? And I think that as we get into industrialized non-tribal societies, we sort of lose their rituals unless you call drinking and drug use, and Robert Bly and Iron John and other people who have written about mythology talk about the loss of these rites of passage. And I think that a lot of us men especially, but I'm sure women too, as we transition from childhood to adulthood, we are at a loss on how to deal with that transition, and that transition is never well defined.
Right.
So we don't we don't make that transition, smoothly, and sometimes we put our own rites of passage there. And I think alcohol and drug use, I know it was mine. That adversity that you have to face before you can go out and face the world. Do you think your alcoholism or alcohol use was part of that, or do you think it was just trying to get in with a crowd and become popular?
I don't know when I think about it. I certainly liked everything about it. So I liked the way it made me feel. I felt different and therefore better. I liked the sneakiness of it, the challenge, the sort of,
the skirting with the edges of the law, right?
Right, whether it was alcohol or marijuana, right. And those were really the main two, at that time, the main two drugs that I used. And then there was the whole sort of social part of it. That was a very big thing, because I had, while I always had friends, that 4-year period of high school, I really felt like I was socially, in my, I had found my lane. Right. I found my lane socially, and I was, in the
you
fast
had your
lane.
group.
I had my group. I had a group.
Yeah, you had your tribe.
Yeah, I really did. I think that is exactly what and it really was like a tribe.
Right.
And you knew the other kids that did it. I mean, there was almost like a ritual handshake. I mean, there was a look where you're like, hey, you want to go? Let's go. We're going to go outside.
I gotcha.
Right. And it really was like a secret society. And so there was a lot of excitement around that. And I think when I got to college, first of all, the workload was much harder.
And you're going to college at WashU, did you say? And you're doing psychology?
Yeah.
Is that what your primary area of interest was?
At the time, the truth is I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I wanted to study people. Mm-hmm. So I actually had my bachelor's is in psychology and sociology, dual major, and I minored in anthropology and in drama. Right. So I was 3 different human studies, and even drama is really very much
very much a human study.
So I knew that those were my interests. Still none of those degrees really get you very far without going a little further. I ended up eventually getting a master's degree in social work. Okay. Which I guess I use today, but I'm in in sales. I'm in a sales. I run a sales organization, so it's different. Yeah. Yeah. I think that my interest was really people. I found people fascinating, and the study of people in all ways. I mean, anthropology is obviously studying the past. Mm-hmm. Sociology studying society, mm-hmm. and psychology, for trying to study the mind. Yeah. The individual.
Did you ever work as a social worker?
I did. So my first 10 years out of college, I worked for the Jewish Community Center. Yeah. I ran youth groups, youth programs, after-school programs, Big Brother, Big Sister, a summer camp. I was the assistant director of their main summer camp down at the Lake of the Ozarks. So it was what is called classical group work. It wasn't therapy. I wasn't a therapist. I never got a license to be a licensed clinical social worker. Mm. That's one direction people go. Right. It was more my specialty when I did get my degree in social work was nonprofit management. So at that time, I saw myself wanting to progress in the nonprofit field in administration, mm-hmm. and running an organization. Which is what my father had done. Right. And which is exactly what he had done.
So were you inspired by your dad's work in that? Or
I think so. He actually started at the J. Before most of his career was the Human Development Corporation, but he actually, his first job was also at the JCCA, doing the exact same job I had. I literally did his same job.
So let me ask you a little bit, perhaps you could take a few minutes and tell us about the JCCA. I'm not very familiar with it. So it's how would you describe it? And it's a nonprofit organization that helps the community the population at large, or how does it work?
So it's tied in tightly with other Jewish organizations. So you have the Jewish Federation, which is similar to the United Way. The Jewish Federation is sort of a fundraising and programmatic arm for the Jewish community. Okay. And the Federation funds different things like the Holocaust Museum, mm-hmm. Jewish children's education. So there's an organization called CAGE, which is Center for, and I can't remember what it stands for, but it's an educational arm. There is Jewish Children's and Family Service, and just like Catholic Children's Services or Catholic Family Services, they serve the whole community. So they're open to anyone that wants help. Right. But it's Jewish funded. Yeah. So there's
when you say Jewish funded, does that mean it's privately funded, or does it get some state and federal dollars as well?
They get some of those things as well. So and the J does too. The Jewish Community Center gets United Way money. Right. They get so for certain programs they get state and federal money. And then they have membership dues, so they have a big athletic facility, and people belong and work out there and swim.
Like the Y.
Like the Y. Yeah. It's interestingly the YMCA is modeled after the original YMHA, the Young Men's Hebrew Association. Yeah. And the J is the Young Men's Hebrew Association. It evolved over 100 years. Huh. So the whole organization nationwide now and worldwide is the Jewish Community Center Association, and there's all these Jewish community centers in every city. Yeah. But they were the Y. They were the YMHA. They were all the YMHA.
Okay. Very interesting. I did not know that. Huh? Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's cool. What the J is. So it's the old YMHA. So it's a very similar programs where there's, a lot of health and fitness related programming, and then all kinds of community center type of after school enrichment, preschool, Big Brother, Big Sister. Single parent, activities, those types of things, and then summer camps, day camps and overnight camps.
So after And I'm assuming that like most nonprofit organizations, a significant amount of time is spent on fundraising and reach out to generate get people involved.
Yes,
And
yes.
because Kate, my friend, also she worked for NPR for a long time, and Channel 9, and so she's still, I think, director of fundraising for something. So I have a little bit of insight.
It's kind of a sales job there. Yeah,
exactly.
Right.
So were you involved in that aspect of it, or were you involved in the
more of the programming? But it's interesting because to get funded, both from the Jewish Federation and the United Way, they measure units of service. Their funding is tied to how many people did you serve and in what capacities. And there's formulas that then help you apply for funding, and it's really you apply for funding based on those things.
I see.
So we were always trying to get more and more participation,
right?
And some of that effort to get participation was because we truly, honestly we knew we were helping people, and we wanted to help as many as we could.
Right.
But some of it was the more people we helped,
number-based, right?
Because they had to pay for me regardless. If I served 100 people or 1,000 people,
right,
the cost was the same. And so, if they could get more funding from all these different funding sources, it helped. It helped us continue to serve people.
Yeah. So, 10 years down the line, doing this work, which is publicly and service-minded, and you decide to change career paths, or
So it's an interesting story, and it's related to my sobriety.
So I was just going to say that, you and I walked that path together,
right.
And one of the reasons that I have always been attracted to you, as a human being, is because of how much I've learned from you along that path, and sometimes your comments, well, most of the time, your comments are not really directed at me, but just because I am there and you have said something which then I think about and then I internalize, that has helped me in my own journey. So I appreciate that, and I, have a lot of love and respect for you in my heart for that. So, having said that, tell us about the interesting story.
First, let me say I want to reciprocate that I always have appreciated your presence in the meeting that we shared together. You're one of the gentle souls in that room, and one of the people that I admire the most, and I have always had same thing. So I appreciate the sentiment. So I had been with the Jewish Community Center for about 10 years. They helped me they helped put me through graduate school. I had been promoted several times into managerial roles, and towards the end of my drinking and drugging, I became a less than optimum employee.
Okay.
I wasn't a good
corporate citizen.
I was actually married and divorced during that time. I was not a good husband. I wasn't a good son. The drinking and the drugging really took over my life, and I wasn't a good friend or any. There was nothing. I was imprisoned by the addiction that I had. And so, unfortunately, it led to the Jewish Community Center, after really making a valiant effort to give me an opportunity to turn myself around, that they eventually, suggested that we part ways. Now they gave me the opportunity to resign, which I did.
Yeah.
So I wasn't fired. I could say I wasn't fired, but there was a discussion where unfortunately at the end of my drinking and drugging, I just wasn't very productive in any part of my life.
Right.
And
you were struggling.
And work was one of them. I was absolutely struggling. I ended up on the streets ultimately.
Yeah.
And so it was a terrible time. But those fences have all since been mended. When I did clean up, which was only about 6 months after I left there. It was I think it helped me hit the bottom I needed to hit.
Mm-hmm. And that is also a hallmark of our journey. That I have a hard time seeing the world in absolutes, black and white, right, good and bad.
Right.
And I think that, a lot of the people who struggle with issues tend to do so because they get into this repetitive, vicious cycle, which takes away who they are as a person. So, I'm talking to you today, and you talk about, not being a good husband, not being a good son, not being a good father. So these are obviously things that are important to you. yeah, we talk about rebirth and recovery, but at the same time, we're still the people we were. As a human being, I was the same guy who was in grade school and blah blah blah, and who I am today. I'm going to be 57 in a few years, in a few days, and I think that we sort of forget what our priorities are. And, what is important to us, because we are, as you were saying, there is this attraction, regardless of what it is to, because it could be as easily to alcohol and drugs as to food, as to, sex, as to anger, or any of those things, right? And any of those things has the power to entrap us and take us away from our humanity. So, I think, for me personally, recovery has been a regaining of my humanity and identifying who I am as a person and being true to that person. So I'm pretty sure we share, similar directions there. So, and sometimes I think, the point I was trying to make was we have to get to that place where everything is dark around us so that we can identify where the light is and start walking towards that light.
Yeah.
So you said, times were pretty tough, and you had no fixed abode. You were basically struggling mightily.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. So and like I started to say, I've long since gone back and repaired the damage there.
Right, because that's part of our recovery,
and it is part of ours. So
yeah.
I'm good friends now with virtually everybody that I worked with, and I participate in all kinds of reunions and get-togethers, and there's a call tonight actually, with a bunch of people from Camp Sabra, which was the camp that the J owns, that I was associated with. A Zoom call where it's a bunch of us get together and just talk. So
I never asked you this, which it's really not relevant, but I was curious about. Did you ever go to Israel and work in a kibbutz?
I did.
You did?
I did.
Okay, tell me a little bit about that experience.
So, when I was at WashU, when I was 21, I took a semester off and I went and lived for 6 months in Israel and worked on a kibbutz. I had wanted to do a semester abroad, and I looked at a bunch of different possibilities. And I'm not sure how I landed. I'll be honest with you. I wasn't, because I didn't grow up. I was very secular,
right?
So I didn't have any real attachment to the state of Israel. I knew it was a Jewish state,
right?
And I was always interested in maybe seeing it, but
right.
I think it really had to do with as I looked for this semester abroad, and I kind of wanted a semester off too. It wasn't that I wanted to study abroad. Yeah. I was looking at different programs, and that was one that someone suggested, probably my college counselor, said, look at this, and it was very inexpensive because you work. So the program itself was wasn't the price of a semester at WashU, because you're helping on the kibbutz, you're working, and then you're studying. And so I did something called the kibbutz alpan, where you learn Jewish history, you study Hebrew, and you work. And I think the price for the whole thing was like $750. That might have included the flight. It was really like a, and so I did that. And I ended up really enjoying, it was really a highlight of my college years. I really enjoyed working on the kibbutz. I traveled all around Israel and learned about the history, not just the Jewish history, but the Islamic and the Christian history.
Right.
I did have the opportunity to, it was, at that time, it was reasonably easy to get into Egypt. There are some challenges with an Israeli stamp on your passport, getting into some of the Arab countries and vice versa.
Even though the whole Sharm el-Sheikh, resort by the Dead Sea.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so it's interesting. Egypt was an easy one to get back and forth.
Right.
Some of the other ones,
not
Lebanon,
not so
even,
much.
Certainly Syria, forget it.
Yeah.
But even Lebanon and Jordan, like if you went, there was a chance you wouldn't be able to get back in.
Which is unfortunate, because it's a great historical area.
It's such an incredible area.
So, what part of Israel did you like the most?
I got
don't say Tel Aviv, because that's where all the nightclubs and all that.
Probably Jerusalem. Just the historic, just the history. I was very, totally into history.
Yeah.
And so sort of into archaeology as part of my anthropology.
Right.
Totally into that stuff.
Yeah.
And so just the history. But I love Caesarea. I mean, I love. By the way, there's so much Roman to see there.
Yeah.
I mean, there's more Roman ruins in Israel than there probably are anywhere else.
Right.
Maybe Rome. Maybe Rome. Second to Rome.
Well, the whole story is kind of, the whole Jewish story and, Christ's story is interlinked with Roman stories.
It's during Rome, right? It's during the Roman rule, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But that's interesting.
Yeah.
Any spiritual experiences while you were there in Jerusalem?
I think, interestingly, probably the most spiritual experience was going through the Holocaust Museum. This is I was there before the one was built in D.C. So it was the early 80s, and there was not one here. And even the one here is not even close to the power, just the power of it. And it was a recognition, I think, it was the sadness, of course, of the loss of 6 million, Jewish lives, but sort of the recognition that somehow we had been saved from that. It was the recognition that now when I was there in the early 80s, it was less than 40 years after the Holocaust, that there were again about the same number of Jews in the world at that time, about 12 million, that there had been prior to the Holocaust. So he eliminated Hitler eliminated about half the Jews worldwide, and that less than 40 years later we were back up to about the same. And now I think it's maybe 16 million. It's a very small number when you think about the big picture.
Yes.
It's a very, very small number. It was so that was very spiritual. I also interestingly kind of had a spiritual experience at Masada, which is where there had been a resistance, where there had been a Jewish resistance, a story of resistance against the Romans. And climbing, we climbed up there's a ramp that you could do, but we did the long walk, right? The hike, and that's how those Jewish soldiers had come up and down to do their attacks against the Roman soldiers. They'd use that little snake path to get up and down, and it was just very interesting because you really saw where they lived. The history comes alive.
Right.
I mean, they found where these people lived. They built little huts in between the two walls that Herod had built there. Then that's where they lived. They didn't want to live in the castle. They lived in these little huts that they used to. There was two walls, and you just had to do side walls to make these little cabins. And that was kind of a spiritual experience. And then of course the old city, the whole thing is just incredible. And back then you could say you could be Jewish and stay in the Arab Quarter. I mean, now I think that those days have kind of passed. But I stayed at a youth hostel, in the Arab Quarter, eating Arab food, the whole bit. Yeah. And it was awesome.
So you had some good falafel.
I had a lot of great falafel and shawarma.
Yeah. Anyways,
and you always kind of looked at it and said, "How long has that thing been spinning?" Because it's just out in the open.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just. There's flies.
Well, yeah. Well, you were hoping, the temperature kind of,
right, exactly.
Get of all of that stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, anyways, that was just an aside, and I don't know that I have had spiritual experiences related to the Holocaust, but what when I think about it is how is it that thinking, feeling people who are loving husbands and loving wives and kids and parents can somehow turn off all sense of right or wrong and let an atrocity like that be perpetrated. And that for me is, one of my biggest fears in life, that society, and you've studied history, human beings are extremely...
We keep doing it. That's not the first time. Right.
It's not the first time. And,
probably not
our memories are short.
Right.
And, and every time we go like, okay, the Jews say never again, right? Yeah. But, it doesn't have to be the Jews.
Right.
It could be somebody else altogether and get picked on because they're a visible minority. And that is why, I'm not a big fan of social media, even though, we're doing this for social media in a way. But I understand the importance of it, that, we can have, people have all kinds of negative reactions to, hashtag Me Too movement, or, Black Lives Matter movement, or, all of these, social awareness themes that we are working on, inequality, LGBTQ plus. And my thing is, it is good that we can communicate with each other. We can be a touch sensitive about things. Perhaps we overplay it, perhaps we are dramatic about. But the important thing is that whatever happens, we can let other people know that this is going on. And so, it becomes harder for it to be perpetrated systemically. And, there's positive aspects of it and negative aspects. I just, don't trust human memory, but,
Well, neither. When you think about it, I mean, even the Uyghurs today, right, in China.
Yeah.
I mean,
or the Kurds
right in Iraq. I mean, it's hard to and in Turkey, right? Because it's sort of that whole area. So it was Kurdistan, and now it's gone.
Yeah.
Kurdistan. And so it's but certainly in the continent of Africa in our lifetime there have been a number of genocides. They were smaller than 6 million, but they were absolute genocides. They were absolutely groups of people eliminated by for political or religious differences.
And genocide. And this leads me to, sometimes reflect negatively on humanity. Genocides that were perpetrated not by automatic weapons and by bombs, and by swords and spears. When 3 million people were massacred over a period of time. And, I just got a message from one of my friends saying, hey, we can do a dirt bike tour. And I was like, in Africa. And I was like, where in Africa? And they were like, Rwanda. And I was like, the only other word that comes to mind when I think of Rwanda is the massacre.
Right.
But, things change. And then again, anyways. So, on to brighter and more positive topics. So, I won't take up more, a lot more of your time. But I know, and I can say this without any hesitation, that, recovery for me has been an absolutely positive force in my life. Would you agree with that? Has it been as instrumental in remaking Leo Rosen into the person that he is today?
I'd start by saying that I wouldn't be alive.
Yeah.
That if I had not found recovery, it saved my life. And that sounds dramatic, but I'm absolutely convinced of it. I wasn't like hospitalized near death. I wasn't physically near death, but I wasn't far from it when I got sober. I weigh 200 pounds right now. I was 135 pounds.
Oh my Lord!
I was 65 pounds. Not that I couldn't stand to lose 10 or 20 right now, but 65 I wouldn't look very healthy.
Yeah.
I was not eating regularly. I was not getting any medical attention. I was had lots of sort of because I was at times on the street exposure. I don't think I could have continued to live that way and lived long. I wasn't homeless living in a dumpster or next to one, but close. Mm-hmm. When you think about my upbringing. Although there were a couple of divorces. By the time my mother married my stepfather, my stepfather's a physician. We weren't wealthy, but we were nicely middle class. Yeah. I had clothes and food and a big house and heat and electricity and a bicycle and all the things that you would want to. I grew up pretty nicely. Had the privilege to go to Washington University, and so when I. My real bottom, I found myself in jail, and I was there for a few weeks. It wasn't like an overnight stay.
Yeah.
I wasn't for months or years. Yeah. It wasn't for months or years, but it was for a few weeks, and it was for doing things, stealing things to use drugs, and but I found myself saying to myself, this is not right. This isn't what I want it to be. This is not who I am, This is not who I want to be. This is not who I want it to be.
Yeah.
If you asked me in kindergarten, what do you want to be when you grow up? You kind of said, did you know what you wanted to be? The answer was no.
Yeah.
But certainly not that.
I knew what I didn't want to be.
For sure not this. And so, jumping, and people, we talked about this. People have to find a bottom that is enough for them to really walk away from because it's difficult. It's addiction to me. It was like a prison that I was in, and to be able to break free from that took a lot. And so recovery saved my life. I'm convinced of it. I think you're right. I think that the good things about me that I know of today, the things my concern for other people, my desire to pay everything forward that I can, my desire to be a good husband and father and son and sibling and friend and employee. I do think I had all of that before. I do think that all of that was part of me, but being freed of this addiction, of this prison of alcoholism and drug addiction, has allowed me to allow those things to come out.
Right. So for those of us, who are listening and who don't have the same kind of insight into recovery that you and I do, perhaps this would not be a bad moment to reflect on the fact that, recovery, we choose to walk along this path, but it is not something that, you just, it's not like putting a shirt on, and saying, okay, now I'm wearing my recovery shirt, right?
Right.
There is a lot of work, on ourselves, on our, way of approaching life, our thinking. And then there is work in terms of, you called it paying it forward. But we have to spread the message, right? And, we have to talk to other people and try and help them in their journey. And I know that you do a lot of it, a lot more than I do. So, tell us a little bit about that.
So, recovery, and I happen to participate specifically in Alcoholics Anonymous. That happens to be the recovery program that I focus on. There's all kinds of them out there, I don't think, in AA itself doesn't think that there is a monopoly on recovery,
right,
on any one of these programs.
Yeah.
And they're just all, and we look to doctors, to physicians, to clergy, to psychologists and psychiatrists also. To help us, so we don't, we certainly don't think we have an exclusive. But what I have found is that I've got to participate actively in my own recovery. That that it is something that I've got to continue to do. Since my sobriety date of July 10th, 1996, I have not drank or drugged. Mm-hmm. But I did have a few years where I was trying to get into recovery before that, where I did relapse.
Right.
So I know from that experience that I've got to be vigilant. I've had people say, well, now that you've been sober so long, you probably don't have to do all these things you're doing. And my experience from prior years was, I think I do.
Yeah.
I think I have to stay engaged. And so this pay it forward, probably the most important step of the 12 steps of recovery is working with others, and that's the 12th step. And it's, we're not evangelical. I mean, so when you talk about spreading the word,
right,
we're not putting up billboards or calling anyone, or anything like that. But we are make ourselves available,
right,
for and we try to be easy to find. So you can find AA and all the other 12-step recovery programs online, or in the if there was a phone book back when there was phone books, in the phone book. And then we make ourselves available if somebody's interested.
So you sponsor other men?
I do.
Yeah, which basically means that you act as a mentor to young men, and we don't sponsor across sexes. So
right,
men sponsor men,
right,
and women sponsor women in our program.
Yeah.
And you also share your strength, hope, and experience, which is basically going out to various meetings and talking about, your journey along this path,
yep,
so that, it gives other people, encourages them and says, okay, yeah, I've had my struggles, but there is a way forward,
yep,
if you are willing to follow this path.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit, perhaps in closing, about Harris House, which is sort of a beacon of recovery for the St. Louis area, and used to be a downtown area, and one of my good friends went to the one out in West County,
mm-hmm,
which was recently established,
mm-hmm,
and I know that you lead some meetings there,
yep,
etc. So
yep,
tell me a little bit about Harris House.
So Harris House is a nonprofit organization. It is they've got a few facilities now. For many, many years they were only solely located down on South Broadway, kind of near Broadway and Marceau, which is River de Pere. It's sort of right where Broadway meets River de Pere.
Yeah.
And it was in basically an old apartment building that they rehabbed it to be into a recovery center. For many, many years, the Harris House, and they actually get state funding for, among other things, some of the funding that's directed towards housing. Because they do house people who often don't have somewhere else to live. But you've got to be in recovery, and you've got to participate in recovery to live there. So it's, sort of a step up from like a Salvation Army, and it's not religious based. So Salvation Army is religious based. They do have a recovery program too, but it's Christian based. This is 12-step based, and And so the Broadway facility is what's called a halfway house, and it's really for people who have been maybe through treatment or who've got at least 30 days of recovery, who go live there, and they go and work, and you have a counselor, and there's meetings there, but mostly you're living around other recovering people who are there for the same reason. They have a dining facility, a kitchen, and they have a cook, and all those things, so that you can live there and thrive there. And people live there from a month to even a year.
Right.
In that facility. The treatment center, which is newer, last decade and a half, in part was started to help fund the halfway house. It was really, in some ways, they started a treatment. There was a need for low-cost treatment. Treatment is pretty expensive. Private treatment is pretty expensive. Typically, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 for a 30-day, private treatment. The Harris House, when they opened their treatment center, it was $6,000.
Wow.
Now it's, I think, 12. 15 years later. But when they first started, and so they wanted a low-cost option for treatment, but that also helped fund that facility that was serving so many men and women.
Let me interject for a minute here. We say, and we know from our experience, when a lot of our fellows seek treatment, they don't have 12 grand, because if they did, they wouldn't be seeking treatment, right?
Correct. Yes.
So,
correct.
So these people, who for the moment have been rendered indigent, and so they don't have the resources to pay for that, even that small amount. Even if it were 6 grand, they wouldn't, or their families wouldn't be able to come up with it. So Harris House accepts donations.
They do.
They're a nonprofit organization.
They're nonprofit.
So anybody who's willing to help or has a family member who is, or their own experience, they can contribute not only by volunteering but also by making financial contributions.
To the Harris House, absolutely. And the Harris House does scholarship treatment, and they scholarship the halfway house. I mean, a lot of people move in to that halfway house, and that's really still, they call it the primary program. It's still their primary program, and it, because it gives people a living environment, a sober living environment that's beyond, people, unfortunately, you and I both know this, a lot of people go to treatment, maybe a job pushed them to go get treatment, or their family members did, and they come out and they don't stay sober because they didn't do anything else. They went for 30 days, they came out, and they didn't do anything to keep themselves sober.
Right.
And that primary program down there on Broadway is designed to really give somebody a runway to learn how to live sober among other sober people.
Yeah, a lot of people, I know that in Chicago there are programs which are essentially called, same thing, but they're called sober living.
Yeah,
which is
sober living, that's exactly what that is. And so it's designed to really give you a runway with some structure. And I happen to have lived there for 6 months. When I got sober in 1996, I lived at the Harris House down on Broadway.
Yeah.
So there is scholarship for the treatment. More importantly, any dollar somebody gives to the Harris House will also support that long-term program that they have down there on Broadway.
Well, that's good to know. We sort of bemoan the fact that we, in this country, and most countries, so we don't really pay a lot of respect or attention to mental health, and these past 2 years that we have lived, with COVID, has kind of brought that home,
because front and center,
So there's a lot of depression, a lot of effects from isolation. Yeah. I'm sure we are not seeing the numbers now, but we'll see somewhere down the road that there was an increase in alcohol use and dysfunctional
suicide. Well, they've already shown the alcohol use
have they
and the suicide. Yeah, there've been increased rates for both. Yeah.
So and addiction is a form of mental
illness.
Absolutely. It's so it is. We can't sort of. I think it got pushed a little bit to the background because it was seen as moral or ethical infirmity, when really there are well-established disease dynamics for it, and I think that our results would be better if we were to treat it as a mental health issue, and if it was dealt with dispassionately without getting our own shoulds and coulds
Right.
involved and
Right.
say, okay, this is a person who needs help.
Right.
This is a community that needs help.
Right.
And, what can we do about it? There's a Canadian psychologist, and he does a lot of stuff on YouTube as well. His name is Gabor Mate. You may have heard of him. His one textbook, work on addiction is called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And you and I can talk about it, later on.
Another time, right.
Yeah. But very insightful treatise on the mental health aspects of recovery and addiction. So I think that's a good place for us to bring our conversation to an end. I thank you so much for being part of the podcast today. And I didn't really mean for it to turn into a recovery podcast, but at the same time, when two people in recovery talk, I don't know how that conversation would not, as you said,
At some point, yeah.
be tangentially or centrally,
Right.
deal with the
Right.
issues of recovery. I appreciate your time, and
No,
I'm
thank
glad
you.
that you were able to come here, despite all the adversity that you faced.
A little bit of an
while doing
interesting
that.
weekend, yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
thanks again, and
thank you very much.
hopefully we'll talk again.
Thanks, Wakas.
I'll see you next
This was
week.
very nice. Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks.